The bank notice arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a man whose cologne couldn't mask the stench of foreclosure. Eleanor Hartwell held the paper in hands that had never known softness, hands that had buried a father and raised two younger brothers on 40 acres of mountain timber that now belonged to everyone but her family. 3 weeks. That's all the time they had. She stood on the porch of the cabin her grandfather had built from lodgepole pine and sweat, watching the mortgage man's wagon disappear into the tree line. The mountains rose around her like cathedral walls, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere in those peaks, bears still ruled and wolves sang to a moon that didn't care about debts or deeds or desperate women. Ellie? Her brother Thomas appeared in the doorway. 14 years old and already carrying the weight of a man who understood they were drowning. What did the paper say? She folded the notice carefully, precisely, as if neat creases could change the words. Said we got until the 1st of October. That's not enough time to... I know. The younger boy, Samuel, only 9, pressed against Thomas's side. The kid still believed in miracles, in last-minute salvation, in the kind of endings that only happened in dime novels. Eleanor had stopped believing in miracles the day consumption took their mother. She believed in land, in blood, in what a person could endure if they had no other choice. That night, she sat at her father's desk, her desk now, and went through the ledgers by lamplight. The numbers hadn't changed. 40 acres of prime timber, a spring-fed creek, and a cabin that could withstand anything nature threw at it, all about to be seized by Franklin Devereaux's bank. The same Franklin Devereaux who'd been buying up every foreclosed property in 3 counties, building an empire on other people's ruin. There was a knock at the door near midnight. Unusual. Dangerous, even. Eleanor grabbed her father's rifle before answering. The man on her porch looked like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves. 6'3" of leather and muscle, with a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months, and eyes the color of winter ice. She knew him by reputation only. Garrett Thorne, the trapper who lived alone in the high country, who came down to town twice a year to sell pelts and buy supplies, who'd once killed a mountain lion with a hunting knife when his rifle jammed. Miss Hartwell... His voice was rough from disuse, like gravel sliding down a slope. Got word in town about your situation. She kept the rifle level. That so? Heard Devereaux is fixing to take your land. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with words, more at ease with silence and solitude. Heard you got nowhere to turn. What's it to you? Garrett Thorne looked past her into the cabin, at the 2 boys peering from their bedroom doorway, at the humble home that somehow held everything that mattered. When he spoke again, his words came slow, deliberate, like a man unused to making offers. I got 300 acres up in the high timber. Got a cabin that's sound and a trap line that brings in decent money. Got no debt, no mortgage, no one breathing down my neck. He met her eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Loneliness so deep it had its own gravity. But I got no wife, no family, nothing but silence and snow 6 months of the year. Eleanor's heart began to pound. I'll pay off your mortgage, he continued. Keep your land in your family's name legal and proper. Your brothers can work it, live on it, call it theirs when they're grown. All I ask in return... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. You're proposing marriage. She said it flat, factual, refusing to let her voice shake. A practical arrangement. You need money. I need company. Someone to make that cabin a home instead of just a place to sleep between trap lines. He pulled an envelope from his coat. Got the money here. $3,000. Enough to clear your debt and give your brothers a start. Thomas stepped forward, his young face twisted with outrage. Ellie, you can't... She held up a hand, silencing him. Her eyes never left Garrett Thorne's weathered face. Why me? Because you're strong. Because you know these mountains. Because I seen you in town and you don't flinch easy." He paused. "And because you got something worth saving. I respect that." The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced like spirits across the log walls. Outside, an owl called, hunting in the darkness. Eleanor thought of her father, of the promises she'd made over his grave, of the land that held 3 generations of Hartwell blood and sweat. "I'll need to think." "No time for thinking." Garrett's voice wasn't cruel, just honest. "Bank notice said 3 weeks. That money needs to be in Devereaux's hand by Friday if you want to stop him from starting foreclosure proceedings early. He's done it before." 2 days. He was giving her 2 days to decide whether to marry a stranger and disappear into the mountains. Eleanor looked at her brothers, at the cabin, at the land beyond the windows. She thought of her mother's grave on the hillside, of her father's hands teaching her to read timber and track game, of every sunrise she'd watched from this porch. Then she thought of losing it all. "I'll marry you," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "But I got conditions. My brothers visit whenever they want. I keep my rifle and my horse, and if you ever raise a hand to me, I'll put a bullet in you and let the mountains have what's left." For the first time, Garrett Thorne almost smiled. "Fair terms. I'll expect the same respect." "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Thorne." "Garrett," he said. "If you're going to be my wife, you ought to call me Garrett." 3 days later, Eleanor Hartwell stood in a dusty courthouse, wearing her mother's wedding dress, her hand clasped in the rough palm of a man she barely knew, and spoke vows that bound her fate to his. Thomas cried. Samuel held his hand. The judge's words echoed in a room that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. When it was over, Garrett handed her the envelope with $3,000, and she walked straight to Franklin Devereaux's bank. The banker's face when she paid the mortgage in full was worth every moment of doubt, every spike of fear, every second thought that had kept her awake the past 3 nights. "The Hartwell land stays Hartwell land," she told him, signing the final papers with a hand that didn't shake. "Now and forever." That afternoon, she packed what little she owned into saddlebags, hugged her brothers until they couldn't breathe, and mounted her horse. Garrett sat astride a massive roan that looked like it could carry a mountain. "Ready?" he asked. Eleanor took one last look at the cabin, at the land, at everything she was leaving behind to save. "No," she said honestly, "but let's go anyway." They rode into the high country as autumn painted the aspens gold, heading toward a future she couldn't imagine, and a marriage that existed on paper and hope and nothing else. The mountains swallowed them whole, and Eleanor wondered if she'd just saved her family or sacrificed herself. Only time and winter would tell. The cabin materialized from the wilderness like something from a fever dream. 3 rooms of hand-hewn logs chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that rose like a declaration against the sky, and windows made of real glass that must have cost a fortune to haul up the mountain. It sat in a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, so tall they seemed to hold up the clouds, with a creek running clear and cold just 30 yards from the front door. It was beautiful. It was remote. It was terrifyingly far from everything Eleanor had ever known. "There's a root cellar out back," Garrett said, dismounting. His voice still carried that rough edge, words rationed like precious supplies. "Keeps things cold year-round, got enough stores to last through winter, but we'll need to hunt and preserve more before the first snow." Eleanor slid from her saddle, legs trembling from the 8-hour ride. They'd climbed from 6,000 feet to nearly 9, and her lungs still hadn't adjusted to the thin air. "When does winter come?" "Could be October. Could be next week. Mountains don't follow calendars." He helped her with her bags, the only gentleness he'd shown since they left the courthouse, and led her inside. The interior was sparse but solid. a wood stove that dominated the main room, a table with 2 chairs, a bed frame in one corner with a mattress that had seen better years. Everything functional, nothing decorative. A man's space, untouched by softness. "You'll want to fix it up however suits you," Garrett said, reading her expression. "I ain't particular about such things." That night, they ate venison stew he'd made from dried meat and root vegetables pulled from the cellar. They sat across the table from each other like strangers at an inn, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I'll earn my keep. I can hunt, trap, preserve meat. I'm not afraid of work." Garrett looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Didn't figure you were." "And the sleeping arrangements?" "There's a second room. Small, but it's got a bed frame. I'll set it up for you tonight." He stood, clearing the bowls. "We're married on paper, miss." He caught himself. "Eleanor, but I meant what I said about practical arrangements. You're here because we both needed something. Don't expect more than that from me, and I won't expect more than honest work and decent company from you." She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something closer to loneliness. The first week passed in a blur of learning where Garrett kept his trapping supplies, how he read weather in the movement of birds and the smell of the wind, which berry bushes were safe and which would kill you as sure as a bullet. He was a patient teacher, if taciturn, showing her his trap lines through timber so dense it blocked out the sky, teaching her to move quiet as a thought through underbrush that wanted to announce every step. "Mountain lion tracks," he said one afternoon, crouched beside a muddy patch near the creek. His finger traced the print with something like reverence. "Big Tom, probably 8 feet nose to tail. Passed through here this morning." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Is it dangerous?" "Everything up here is dangerous. Bears, wolves, cats, weather, isolation." He stood, meeting her eyes. "But you knew that when you came. Question is, can you live with it?" She thought of her brothers, of the land deed locked in the courthouse safe with Hartwell still written on it. "I can live with it." "Good." Garrett almost smiled again. "Because there's no going back once the snows come. These mountains become a cage from November to April. Beautiful cage, but a cage all the same." As weeks passed, Eleanor began to understand the rhythm of this place. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of wind sound and bird call, the distant bugle of elk, and the closer scratch of squirrels in the pine bark. Garrett moved through it like a ghost, checking traps at dawn, hunting in the afternoons, teaching her everything he knew with a patience that surprised her. But at night, they retreated to separate rooms, strangers under the same roof. She watched him sometimes when he didn't know she was looking. Watched the way his hands moved with absolute certainty, whether skinning a rabbit or repairing a trap. Watched the rare moments when his face softened at the sight of an eagle riding the thermals or a particularly beautiful sunset, turning the peaks to fire. There was a man under all that silence, but he kept it locked away like something too valuable to risk. One evening in early October, Eleanor found Garrett on the porch, staring at the mountains. She brought him coffee, something she'd learned he treasured more than gold, and stood beside him. "Your brother's doing all right?" he asked. He always asked. It was one of the few personal things he consistently said. "Got a letter when I went down for supplies. Thomas is managing the timber sales. Samuel's learning his numbers." She paused. "They asked when I'm coming to visit." "Spring," Garrett said. "Soon as the pass clears, I'll take you down myself." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His jaw tightened. "But we made an agreement. Your family stays your family. I won't be the man who takes you away from them." Eleanor studied his profile in the dying light. "What about your family, Garrett? You never speak of them." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "Had a wife once." Sarah. Got cholera our second year of marriage. Buried her down in the valley before I came up here." He took a long sip of coffee. "Mountains don't ask questions. Don't expect answers. That suited me for a long time." "Until it didn't?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the loneliness again. "Until I realized 10 years had passed and I'd forgotten how to talk to people. Forgotten what it felt like to have someone to come home to." His voice dropped. "You think it's easy living alone? It ain't. But you get used to it, and then you get trapped in it. And then one day you look around and realize you built yourself a real nice prison." The first snow came that night, October 12th, earlier than Garrett had expected. Eleanor woke to a world transformed, everything white and pristine and absolutely silent. She stood at the window, watching flakes the size of coins drift down, and felt the mountains close their fist around the cabin. Winter had arrived. The cage had locked. She found Garrett already up, stoking the fire to a roar. "Storm's going to last 3 days," he said. "Maybe 4. We'll need to bring in extra wood, check all the window seals, make sure nothing's going to freeze we don't want frozen." They worked through the morning, preparing for the siege. As they hauled the last load of firewood, Eleanor slipped on ice and went down hard. Garrett caught her before she hit the ground, his arms suddenly around her, strong and sure. For a heartbeat, they stood there, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his beard, smell the pine and wood smoke that clung to him. Feel the solid warmth of a man who'd survived winters that would have killed softer people. "Careful," he said, his voice rough. "Ice up here doesn't forgive." "Neither do I," she said. But she didn't pull away immediately. That night, the storm howled like something alive and angry. The cabin shook but held, testament to the skill of the man who'd built it. Eleanor sat by the fire, trying to read a book by lamplight, but the words kept blurring. Garrett worked on a trap across from her, his hands steady despite the violence outside. After an hour of pretending to read, Eleanor closed the book. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, waiting. "Why did you really come to my cabin that night? $3,000 is a fortune. You could have bought companionship a lot cheaper than a marriage." Garrett's hands stilled on the trap. "Because I saw you at your father's funeral, saw you standing there in the rain, not crying, just enduring, like you'd made a promise to be strong and wouldn't break it no matter what it cost you." He met her eyes. "Recognized that. Recognized you." "Recognized what?" "Someone trying to carry a mountain alone." The words hit her like a fist to the chest. Eleanor felt something crack inside her, some wall she'd built after her mother died, after her father followed, after she'd taken on the weight of saving everyone and had no one to save her. "I'm tired, Garrett," she whispered. And suddenly tears were coming, tears she'd held back for 2 years. For 24 months of being strong for Thomas and Samuel and the land and the legacy. "I'm so damn tired of being the one who has to be strong." He moved without hesitation, crossing the space between them, pulling her against his chest. He smelled like snow and pine and something wild, and his arms felt like the first safe thing she'd touched in years. "Then don't be," he said into her hair. "Not tonight. Not here." Eleanor cried against his shirt while the storm raged and the fire burned low, and when her tears finally stopped, she looked up at this mountain man who'd bought himself a wife but was offering something more valuable. Partnership. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me." Garrett's hand came up to her face, his thumb rough against her cheek. "Hard not to see you, Eleanor. You burn too bright." Something shifted between them then, something neither had planned for, something that had been growing in the quiet moments and shared work and the slow revelation of two lonely people recognizing each other. When he kissed her, it was gentle, questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she kissed him back, tasting coffee and something sweeter, something like hope. That night, the cabin had only one occupied bedroom. The practical arrangement became something real, something chosen, something that felt less like sacrifice and more like salvation. Outside, the storm buried the world in white. Inside, two people who'd married as strangers finally became what they'd promised to be, husband and wife. Winter in the high country was a thing of terrible beauty. The world reduced to white and gray and the dark green of pines, the cold so profound it made your teeth ache, the silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. For 5 months, Eleanor and Garrett lived in their mountain cage, and the isolation that might have driven wedges between them instead drew them closer. They fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Garrett still ran his trap lines, but now Eleanor went with him, learning to read sign in the snow, to reset snares with hands gone numb despite heavy gloves. She learned that he sang sometimes when he thought he was alone, old ballads in a surprisingly good baritone, and that he had a talent for whittling that produced a growing collection of small wooden animals. "For your brother," he said one night, holding up a carved elk. "For Samuel. Figured he'd like it." Eleanor took the elk, tracing the delicate antlers with her finger. "You're a good man." Garrett Thorne. "Just a man," he said, but his ears went red the way they did when she complimented him. She learned his scars by lamplight and touch, the claw marks across his ribs from the mountain lion, the puckered bullet wound in his shoulder from a claim dispute years ago, the dozens of smaller marks that mapped a life lived hard and survived. He learned her nightmares, the ones where she lost the land anyway, where her brothers called her name and she couldn't reach them. On those nights, he held her until the fear passed, his presence an anchor in the dark. "They're safe," he'd remind her. "The land is safe. You did what you set out to do." "At what cost?" she asked one night after a particularly bad dream. Garrett propped himself on one elbow, looking at her in the moonlight that filtered through the frosted window. "You think you gave something up coming here?" "Didn't I? Maybe. But maybe you gained something too." His hand found hers under the quilts. "I know I did." December brought Christmas, which Eleanor insisted on celebrating, despite Garrett's grumbling about fool traditions. She used dried cranberries and pine boughs to decorate the cabin and made him close his eyes while she presented his gift. A new hunting knife she'd been working on in secret, the handle wrapped in elk leather she'd tanned herself. "Eleanor?" His voice was thick. You didn't have to." "I wanted to." His gift to her was a necklace made from a piece of jade he'd found in the creek, polished smooth and hung on a leather cord. "My grandmother was half Shoshone," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "She used to say jade brought protection and love. Figured you could use both." That night they made love by firelight, slow and tender, and Eleanor realized with a start that she was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. The girl who'd married a stranger to save her family's land had found something she hadn't been looking for, home. But winter wasn't finished with them. In late January, a storm came that made the October snow look gentle. For 6 days, the world vanished in white fury. The cabin shook. Drifts piled 10 feet high against the walls. They burned through wood faster than Garrett liked, rationing to make sure they'd have enough to last. On the 4th day, Garrett went out to check the stores and came back white-faced. "Lost the root cellar door. Snow's gotten into the provisions. Meat's still good, but we lost half the vegetables." Eleanor did the math in her head. "How long will what we have last?" "If we're careful? Until April, maybe? And if the thaw comes late?" Garrett's silence was answer enough. They rationed from that day forward. Smaller meals stretched further. Garrett talked about hunting once the storm broke, but they both knew game would be scarce after a storm like this. Everything with sense would be hunkered down, conserving energy, surviving. By late February, Eleanor could count her ribs. Garrett had grown gaunt, his face all sharp angles and hollows, but he still gave her the larger portions, still insisted she eat first. She fought him on it until he finally snapped. "Damn it, Eleanor, I've survived lean winters before. You haven't. You think I'm going to let you starve up here because I was too stubborn to prepare better? This isn't your fault. The hell it isn't. I knew that cellar door was getting weak. I should have reinforced it before winter, should have laid in more stores, should have—" His voice cracked. "Should have kept you safe." Eleanor crossed to him, took his face in her hands. "You have kept me safe. You're still keeping me safe. We're going to survive this, Garrett. Together." He pulled her close and she felt him shaking. This man who'd faced down mountain lions and grizzlies, who'd lived alone in the wilderness for a decade, was terrified, not of dying, but of failing her. "I love you," she said into his chest, and felt him go still. "I don't know when it happened, but it did. I love you, Garrett Thorne, and we're going to make it through this because we're stronger together than we ever were apart." His arms tightened around her. "I love you too," he said roughly. "God help me. I love you so much it scares me." The thaw came in mid-March, sudden and violent. The temperature rose 30 degrees in 2 days. Snow turned to slush, the creek became a torrent, and the world ran with meltwater. Garrett immediately set out to hunt, and Eleanor went with him despite her weakness. They found elk yards 5 miles from the cabin, a dozen animals, gaunt but alive, that had survived the winter in a sheltered valley. Garrett brought down a young bull with a single shot, and they both nearly cried with relief. Fresh meat. They would make it. By late April, the pass had cleared enough for travel. Garrett and Eleanor rode down the mountain together, both lean as whipcords but alive, married in every sense of the word. At the valley floor, they split up. Garrett to sell furs and buy supplies, Eleanor to visit her brothers. She found them on the land, working the timber, and they whooped when they saw her. Thomas had grown 3 inches. Samuel had lost 2 teeth. The cabin looked good, well-maintained, the land prosperous. "You did it," Thomas said, hugging her tight. "The land's still ours." "It was always yours," Eleanor told him. "I just made sure it stayed that way." "Was it worth it?" Samuel asked, with a child's brutal honesty. "Being married to that mountain man?" Eleanor looked back toward the peaks where Garrett was waiting for her, where their cabin stood solid against whatever winter would bring next year. She thought of the hunger and fear, but also the laughter and love, the nights by the fire and the dawns in the snow, the feeling of being truly known by another person. "Yeah," she said softly. "It was worth everything." That night, in a hotel in town, the first real bed they'd slept in since November, Garrett pulled her close and asked, "You miss it? The valley, your brothers, the easier life?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I miss them, but I don't miss the life. That cabin in the mountains, that life with you, that's my home now. It's a hard life. I'm a hard woman." She kissed him. "We're matched, you and I." Garrett smiled, a real smile, the kind that transformed his weathered face into something beautiful. "Yeah, we are." They returned to the high country in May, laden with supplies, ready for another year. As they climbed back into the mountains, Eleanor looked at the man riding beside her, no longer a stranger, no longer just a husband on paper, but her partner, her love, her home. She'd married the mountain man to save her family's land, but in doing so, she'd saved something else, herself, and she'd found something she hadn't known she was missing, a love as wild and enduring as the mountains themselves. The cabin appeared through the trees exactly as they'd left it, waiting. Garrett helped her dismount, and together they stood looking at this place they'd built into a home. Not just a practical arrangement anymore, but something real, something chosen every day. "Welcome back," Garrett said. Eleanor took his hand, looking at the mountains that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners to lovers. "Welcome back," she echoed. The peaks stood eternal around them, keeping their secrets, holding their promises. And in that high country where winter ruled and only the strong survived, two people who'd found each other in desperation had built something that would last, a marriage forged in necessity, tempered by hardship and transformed by love. The mountains had tested them, they had endured, and they would face whatever came next together, as they'd always been meant to. Two souls matched by fate and choice, wild and free and forever bound. Thank you for staying to the end. Where are you watching from?